Previously on the marketing mixtape.
But even just before we start running a test, what do we need to think about as far as ad account structure, ad groups?
Exactly. So we talked about just before talking about maybe decisions you need to make when approaching split testing, as in just strategic decisions, right? What's the minimum amount of data you're going to need? What's the frequency? When are you going to test? Running ads with no attribution model is kamikaze, right? You don't know where you're going and it's not going to end well. So you just as a basic passport for success, even if it's very elementary success, is you need to have an attribution model. You need to be measuring a few key metrics, and those key metrics can also be the flagship for where you will direct your split testing efforts as well. Cost per lead, cost per 1,000 clicks, on-page conversion rate, final acquisition cost. It can be a lot of different things, but you have to have, as you said, Bruce, you have to have attribution tracking, everything set up. And it's so simple. I mean, today there's so many resources out there, and it's very self-directed and intuitive. It's not difficult to set up conversion tracking, and not to mention retargeting and segmentation. That's like a whole nother level of this conversation. But audiences, segmentation, retargeting, understanding frequency of the audiences, that is a whole nother level. But if you're talking of just campaigns that are conversion driven, and you're looking at making tests, you need to make sure your attribution and tracking is all set up and dialed in.
Again, we've got the classical A/B, which is comparing and contrasting. We're just changing one item, one variable, and giving it two different options. We're comparing one against the other. So we generally have a starting out point, which is our base. And then we have the new variant, which is kind of to prove our hypotheses that we formed before the test. Right. And again, this comes back to what do we prioritize for testing? It's the elements that essentially we believe are going to have the biggest impact. That's where we kind of start out. Bearing in mind what you mentioned about scaling up as opposed to down. So, I'm talking about one specific element of an ad, for example. Let's test the headline before we test the description, because that's where we believe the biggest impact is going to be. If we already tested headlines, then we're going to start looking at CTAs, which would probably have a higher impact than an ad description or ad copy. And then we've got multivariate, which is where multiple variables are tested at the same time. I know you kind of mentioned that, again, maybe gives us more results in a faster period of time, a shorter period of time, but it's also harder to figure out what's working.
Very disruptive. Correct? It's very disruptive. Yeah, I would always choose isolation. As in, when I mean isolation, I mean individually testing elements, and I honestly have never seen multi-testing other than this is like a chaotic campaign, and you need to kind of do something overnight. It's not ever been proven to be more successful than isolation, because the reality is if you've structured your account properly, you've structured the campaign properly, you've understood the best bidding strategy, you've understood the best audience type, you've made an effort in creating an ad that is founded on research and what you're aligning with, whatever the goal, the objective of the campaign is, there is absolutely no reason why you should be testing multiple aspects at the same time on the same campaign. When you refer to isolation, we refer to components in an ad, in a campaign. So that starts to sit as simple as the ad itself. And the ad, if you're on a display campaign, it could be a graphic. If it's a PMAX campaign, it could be a video or graphic. If it's a search campaign, it can be headlines, the descriptions, the extended description. It can be the call to action. It can be the copy and the call to action. It can be the automated headlines. It can be rotating headlines. Then you go further up. You can talk actually about the creative itself. Then you can go further up and include the audiences or the contextual targeting methods that you're using. You can go further up and talk about geographical targeting, demographical targeting. Then you can go further up, talk about strategy as to bidding and how you want to optimize the campaigns. And then you can go as far up as talk about campaign strategy. So what's the objective of the campaign? Now, through that pyramid of events, the lower, as I said at the beginning, if you go from the bottom up, you will probably see more results in the shorter period of the time, allowing for your split test to be shorter in investment in regards to time and effort, and more productive, because you'll see a difference in like a couple of days, conclude and move forward. So you're just repeating this cycle. And as you go further up the campaign, you'll most likely see that everything will come together way better than if you change things at different levels in the campaign, as I explained before in the hierarchy. For example, if you change the headline in an ad, and at the same time you change the geographical location. So you are targeting Dallas, and then you target Washington. So you've just made a very big change to your ad, your targeting, and at the same time you change your headline. And then from one day to the next, you get 10 more conversions. Let me ask you, are those conversions thanks to what change?
Yeah, there's
The
no way of
location
knowing.
change or the headline. So now we have a problem. So that's why it is better to change things in isolation and make changes with a bit of a gap, like a couple of days or a week or so between. And that way you generally can build a better paper trail that will help you build better conclusions in the future about your campaigns and account structure.
Sure, and I guess like some of the split testing we're talking about here actually goes, wider than the actual campaign itself. If we're talking about changing audience or geographical location, that's almost like a business decision, a business strategy split test, as opposed to an actual campaign level testing of creatives. And so just to kind of cap off on this, what uplift should we be looking for? What uplift goal should we be looking for as a minimum to say, okay, like running this test is even worth it?
Well, I mean, just to start with, when you're doing a split test, to make any split test work, you need obviously a minimum amount of data, right? So let's say a search campaign. A search campaign, which is generally low volume because it's expensive. Let's say we're looking at a minimum of 100 to 300 clicks, right? So maybe if you have a very small account, it could be 100 clicks. If you have a bigger account, it could be 300. But you're going to need a minimum amount of data to kind of make a decision as to if you have the bandwidth to do a split test. Now, the upside of a split test is going to depend on A, the volume of traffic that you're acquiring, and B, the investment into acquiring that traffic. So an example is if you change an ad, the actual ad creative. Let's say you change out the ad creative. Let's say that you think that the ad that you created can perform better if you put, for example, a video in-stream ad, you put the hook in the first 4 seconds instead of it's at 15 seconds in. So the ad originally had the hook at 15 seconds, it's now going to be 4 seconds in. So you change around the ad. Let's say your conversion rate on the page previously was 10%, and you were buying clicks for 50 cents on the dollar. So 1,000 clicks cost you $500, and your conversion rate now went from 10% to 15%. So you've now got, for every 1,000 clicks, you had 100 conversions, opt-ins. Now you've got 150 opt-ins. So your acquisition
we're talking about
cost,
a 50% lift. So
exactly.
That's a great difference.
And now you apply the 50 clicks in regards to compound as to what you can reinvest in acquiring more traffic. Proportionately, it's a lot more. So I always recommend is that you need that minimum quantity of data to make things worth the effort. And you definitely need to make sure that when you're analyzing outcome, obviously the bigger the impact or the change is going to be always positive. Reinvest it into growing the account, reinvest into growing the campaigns, because that's where you can get the most ROI.
Yeah, and that actually brings us on to the next topic, which is extracting insights and optimizing, consistent optimizing and reiterative optimization. The smaller the group we're testing, or the smaller the amount of results, the bigger the uplift needs to be to make those results statistically significant. We're not going to get into the kind of the scientific equation here to explain how it's calculated, the statistical significance. But basically, there's a bunch of calculators out there. We actually share a couple. There's one site called abtestguide.com/calc, CALC calculator. And that lets you calculate pre and post test results So test your hypotheses and then test the actual results
Right.
once you've run the test.
Yeah.
And what that lets you figure out is, and you can run some numbers through it to understand the equation, but basically the smaller the amount of results you're getting, so the amount of clicks, the amount of landing page, conversions, that call the conversions, the smaller the amount of conversions, the bigger the uplift needs to be in the test results for them to mean anything, basically. So what else do we kind of need to be looking at there? I know you mentioned about, bearing in mind seasonality when we're running tests. Anything else we need to think about to avoid false positives?
Yeah, the major thing here is, seasonality is a big push-pull factor, but the big thing that people often overlook is devices. You have to be very acute about what device you're doing your test on. That's why I'm a big fan of splitting campaigns by device, because how mobile distributes the network of media is very different to how desktop distributes media. When I mean distribution, I mean how the ad networks get your changes out there in lightning speed and get your changes, populated on all platforms in such a small amount of time. It's very, very different. To give you an example, mobile, because since iOS 14 and all of the updates in GDPR, etc., mobile actually tends to take a little longer than desktop. So you can make a change and it will probably be represented faster on desktop and mobile. Just to start with, we have a big caveat, the big nuance that you have to bear in mind. Second thing is, if you make a change on an ad or a campaign, and it could perform differently on desktop than it does on mobile, and if you haven't separated those conversions, you've also got a caveat that you're going to have to consider when concluding if the split test, the variable that you improved on, wins versus the one you had previously. And the last thing is splitting traffic at the top of the funnel. So some landing page builders allow you to do this, some don't, but you can bring traffic in and create two landing pages that look the same, like version A and version B. And I've done this on Go high level. I've done this on lead pages. I've done this on funnel, on click funnels, different landing page builders, and WordPress as well. But you can split them, right? You can literally do A and B in the same landing page, duplicate the content, and just change very small things. Now, when you do this, to avoid false positives, again, you have to have exactly the same conditions in the campaigns to consider one is better than the other. To actually make a true 100% conclusion, you have to have identical campaign settings to split traffic. So when I see people saying, oh, I did this split test and I just created a new landing page and it converts so much better, and I look at the campaign, I'm like, hey, but you've got 3 times the budget, a completely different bidding strategy, and oh, by the way, the actual ad you put there is different copy to the ad over here. Wait, this isn't a split test. This is another campaign. So when you're split testing, for example, landing pages or landing page copy, which we haven't talked a lot about there, which is a whole nother subject, you want to make sure that you're using pure data. So that means that your campaigns that you've built should be duplicated and should be absolutely matching and functional before you introduce a change. That could be splitting the traffic and having 2 landing pages side by side with a very small tweak in the headline or the call to action or the pop-up or the copy or the VSL, whatever the content is.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about separate ad groups or campaigns to target different devices, though, because it sounds to me like that could be a good way of running a between quotes multivariate test. Because we could be testing within different campaigns which are very similar but already have a different targeting set. We could be testing different variables just one at a time in each campaign, but then we're pulling data, we're running more tests faster, get more results, but then we can then compile those.
The only thing I was going to add to that is when you are splitting traffic by device, one of the big things about that is you will notice how different the cost is in average 10,000 clicks, 1,000 clicks, or however you're measuring your average cost per click frequency. You will notice the difference. And what this tells you is where your competitors or your market is putting their dollars. And that is a great way to find gaps. For example, we had a campaign where we were really struggling to get cost per lead down. And we had mobile and desktop all wrapped into one campaign. And we split them. And immediately I noticed desktop cost per lead just like plummeting down, like really positive cost per lead, like it was going down and down and down and down and down, and we weren't doing anything other than just split the traffic by device. And do you know what I found out? We didn't have anyone competing on those keywords or those targeting options or those audiences on desktop. So again, when you split traffic from a split test perspective, a pure split test perspective, you have to be careful because you're not giving it the same conditions on either side. So you're talking different devices, different landscape, and it's also a different intent. Somebody who opts in on their phone or buys on their phone is a completely different audience than somebody who buys on desktop. They might be the same demographic, they might be the same age, but there's different intent. Someone who's searching on their computer, statistics show it is a different search than it is on mobile. When I type in Google on my mobile phone, I have tons of typos, just to start with. So you can imagine people purchasing things on their phone. I mean, I do purchase things on my phone. You go onto Amazon, you buy something on your phone, but what you have to understand here is when you are analyzing data, you can't compare apples to apples when you're splitting traffic. You can say one is better than the other, but they're two different landscapes. And it's how the audience reacts on two different devices is what is going to dictate if one is better suited for your business versus the other. And hopefully you will find a device that works better for your businesses. I've seen companies advertise on TV and do very well because it's very cheap. No one wants to advertise on TV. No one wants to advertise on flat screens because hey, it's like, people play music in their home through YouTube and you see an ad and they're like, oh, that doesn't matter. But you know what? It's super cheap. You want to know why? Because no one advertises on it. So
I guess it comes back to what we talked about last time, understanding your audience as well.
Yeah, of course.
Obviously, there can be audiences this is going to make more sense for, other audiences this make less sense.